Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining our Navigating Financial Aid for Immigrant Families webinar. We cover this topic during our advanced FAFSA training, but today's session will give us a chance to go a little bit more in depth. My name is May Whiting, and I am the Data and Research Manager at Alabama Possible. I am joined today by Dylan Cafferty, the FAFSA State Coordinator with the Utah System of Higher Education. As always, we'd like to recognize and thank our sponsors for supporting this work and making this training opportunity possible. We are incredibly grateful for our partners at the Alabama Commission on Higher Education, Alabama Community College System, and Alabama State Department of Education. Thank you so much for being an integral part of the Alabama Goes to College campaign. So a few housekeeping notes before we get started. Please keep your microphones on mute at all times to avoid any feedback during the presentation. This webinar will be recorded and posted to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/Alabama Possible. And then lastly, you can submit questions throughout the webinar using the chat feature. Please feel free to share your commitment to building a college-going culture by tagging us in your posts. You can find us at AL Goes to College. And if you use any of the hashtags below, we can see your work, we can celebrate your work, and we can learn from everything that y'all are doing. So you can use hashtags like AL Goes to College, Pell Yes, FAFSA, and Cash for College whenever you're posting about financial aid topics. All right, high schools can still sign up for the Alabama Goes to College campaign. You can do that at alabamapossible.org/register 2021-22. Most of you in attendance today are probably working with a school that is already registered, but if not, your school can sign up now. We do only need one representative from each school to complete the registration form. Now, the Alabama Goes to College campaign wants every student in our state to have the opportunity to plan for, pursue, and complete valuable post-secondary credentials. There are 3 different components of the Alabama Goes to College campaign, but today we are really going to focus on Cash for College, which builds awareness around financial aid opportunities for post-secondary education. The goal of Cash for College is for every graduating senior who is eligible to complete their free application for federal student aid, or the FAFSA, before they graduate from high school. And this will allow them opportunities to access federal, state, and institutional aid. And so today we'll talk a lot about aid options for students who are not eligible for federal aid and therefore cannot complete the FAFSA. So we'll definitely go into that. But here is a look at today's agenda. We're going to start by reviewing key terms and definitions. Dylan will provide us with some timely updates on relevant federal policy. We'll describe federal aid eligibility based on citizenship status. We'll investigate complicated FAFSA scenarios, review aid options for students who cannot complete the FAFSA, and then we'll explore some strategies and tools for working specifically with immigrant families. So please remember, we are more than happy to accept your questions throughout this training. You can type them in the chat. For those of you who submitted a question during the registration process, we plan on addressing your question throughout the presentation. And I want to preface all of this by saying that I am definitely not a legal expert in the area of immigration, but we as an organization are always consulting with federal student aid, as well as with other organizations that do have that expertise. So if you have a question that I cannot answer or a question that Dylan cannot answer, we are happy to do further research. We're also happy to connect you to someone who might already have those answers. So we'll go ahead and get started with some key terms. So key terms and definitions. An immigrant in our context here refers to people residing in the United States who are not US citizens at birth. So this kind of umbrella term encompasses many different experiences and situations, and we'll go into some of those as we move through the presentation. An undocumented individual is a person who entered the US legally and has an immigration status that has expired, or is a person who entered the US without authorization. Now, a DACA recipient is a person who has been granted protection under deferred action for childhood arrivals. Dylan will discuss DACA in more detail during the federal policy update. And then a dreamer is a documented, so a student who has documentation under DACA, or undocumented youth. And these are persons who arrived as children or youth to the United States and have not been able to find a path to naturalization. So these are some of the terms that you might hear throughout today's webinar. But now I will turn it over to Dylan to describe some of the federal policy landscape and how that relates to students as they are pursuing college and applying for financial aid.
Thank you, May. And just to give a quick introduction, my name is Dylan Cafferty. I am the FAFSA State Coordinator for the Utah System of Higher Education. I am in Utah. The main thing I do is coordinate all the FAFSA night events throughout our state of Utah and connect volunteers from financial aid offices and other places to assist with those events. And I also assist with many other items such as helping students and providing resources. Very excited to be here today. I am also not a legal professional, so if I don't have an answer to your question, we'll try and find the right place to get those answers. But I'm very excited to be joining today and to discuss some of these tough topics. You know, many of these items that we're going to be discussing today can be major barriers for students for higher education, and especially if they don't know what they're doing with that. So to be more knowledgeable and be ready can help you help them. So thank you, May, again, for letting me return this year. To kind of discuss the relevant federal policy that's going on, just to give you some quick context of DACA. So DACA stands for the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. And the background of this is it was an executive order under the Obama administration back in 2012. It's mainly for immigrant youth who have come to the US as children, and it temporarily gives them protection from deportation and gives them a work permit for 2 years, and they have the potential for renewal on those. And there are a lot of updates since then. We went through the Trump administration that caused a lot of roller coaster items to happen, and since then we've got a latest update that you should all know about, and that is just recently back in July, on July 16, 2021, a Texas judge declared the DACA program to be unlawful, and the federal government has, and this is kind of for lack of a better word that I could find, they've paused any new DACA requests. So what's happened is the court has held that the DACA program is unlawful. It set aside the DACA program and the 2012 U.S. Department of Homeland Security, or DHS, memorandum that originally established DACA. That was kind of what I was talking about just a moment ago. It has remanded DACA back to DHS to take steps to comply with the court's orders. That's kind of where we're at. What does this mean for students? Those who already have DACA will not lose it, and they will still be able to renew. So that's a good thing. And then those who have not been granted DACA are still eligible for DACA can still apply for DACA, and the USCIS will continue to accept first-time requests. However, this is the issue here, and this is the pause. But the federal government is prohibited from approving any first-time requests after July 16th of 2021. So those students are kind of stuck at the moment until legislation has moved forward, and we're just trying to wait and hear on what's going to happen next. Also, a new thing that's happening, a new legislation, is the Reconciliation Package or Build Back Better Act. And this information is as of just a couple of days ago. So things may be changing in the next couple of weeks, months. We'll see what happens. But right now, they've got it in this Build Back Better Act that the Pell Grant will increase for $550. So the max Pell for a student could be $7,000, roughly $7,000, $7,045. A nice thing here is they've got it in the legislation that DACA students would be eligible for Title IV aid. So that will open a lot of doors for our DACA students. There will be an investment increase to historically Black colleges and universities, HBCUs, tribal colleges and universities, TCUs, and then minority serving institutions, MSIs, and others. And then there's a lot more legislation. I've got a link there at the bottom that you can explore if you want to see in more detail the different parts of that act. Originally in the act, there was a funding for community college, for free community college, sorry. But sadly, that has been eliminated from the bill as it's gone through the House. And so what's happening right now is that on November 17th, 2021, the House advanced this legislation that I kind of talked about so far for the act. Now we're just kind of waiting on the Senate to review this and make possible revisions to it or pass it forward. So we're just waiting to hear back for that. So keep an eye out for that. Depending on what they do or what revisions they make, we may be waiting a little while or things may move forward. But there's information on that as well with the link I have below. So that is all that's majorly happening right now with federal policy. So fingers crossed, open some doors for some students, and we'll see what happens.
Perfect. Thank you, Dylan. So Dylan covered how federal policy is impacting DACA recipients, both generally and then their aid eligibility specifically. So now we kind of want to just talk about federal aid eligibility for all kinds of immigrant populations. And we're going to start by describing federal student aid and some more terms that you'll hear us use throughout the webinar. So federal student aid is responsible for managing the student financial assistance programs authorized under Title IV of the Higher Education Act of 1965. So these programs provide grants, work-study opportunities, and loans to fund students who are attending college or career school. So you'll hear us say both federal aid eligibility as well as Title IV eligibility, kind of using those terms interchangeably. But of course, we know that federal aid is not the only available financial aid to students who are pursuing post-secondary pathways. So we're going to talk both about federal aid as well as other kinds of aid like state aid and scholarship aid. But we're going to start off with federal aid. So let's talk about eligibility requirements. Who is eligible for federal financial aid? To be fully eligible to accept federal financial aid, students must either have a high school diploma or GED certificate, or complete an approved homeschool education, or meet one of the ability to benefit alternatives. The student must also be a US citizen or eligible non-citizen. So this is what we're going to spend a lot of time defining and discussing in detail today. And then the student must have a valid Social Security number, with the exception of students from the Republic of the Marshall Islands, Federated States of Micronesia, and the Republic of Palau. So one person in the registration questions asked, how families without a social security number create an FSA ID and then complete the FAFSA. And the answer is that if a student does not have a social security number, they will not be able to create an FSA ID and complete the FAFSA unless they are a student who has one of these exceptions listed here. So the student completing the FAFSA does need that social security number to create their FSA ID and start the form. A parent, however, does not need a social security number. And while they would need a social security number to create the FSA ID, a parent can actually help their student complete the FAFSA without creating an FSA ID. And we'll talk a lot more about that process in the coming slides. But these bulleted items here are requirements for a student to be eligible to accept federal aid. So in addition, the student must also be enrolled or accepted as a regular student in an eligible degree or certificate program. When in college, they have to maintain satisfactory academic progress as defined by the college. And then they'll also need to sign certifying statements on the FAFSA. And these statements are mostly applicable to current college students who have already been receiving federal aid. So they're things like, you are not in default on a federal student loan, you do not owe money on a federal student grant, and then other statements as well. But you might be asking for students who are considered dependent students for the purposes of the FAFSA, and therefore they have to provide parental information, what kind of criteria apply to the parents? So more specifically, does the citizenship status of a parent impact the aid eligibility of the student? And the answer is no. Citizenship status of a parent does not impact a student's aid eligibility, but the citizenship status of the parent might impact how the student completes their FAFSA. And then it might also impact some of the steps that follow submission of the FAFSA. And because of that, we strongly recommend that students with undocumented parents complete the FAFSA with an advocate who can guide them through the entire process from start to finish. And so Alabama Possible is definitely here to assist you with that. So to go into this a little bit further, the FAFSA doesn't actually ask about the citizenship of a parent. What it does ask is the parent's social security number. And so if a parent does not have a social security number, on the FAFSA, they will enter all zeros when asked for social security number. And I'll note here that the parent should never use an individual taxpayer identification number or an ITIN here if they have one. And just to give a little bit of background about the ITIN, the IRS will issue individual taxpayer identification numbers to help individuals comply with US tax law. So ITINs are essentially used to process and account for tax returns for those individuals who are not eligible for social security numbers. And these are issued regardless of immigration status. So an undocumented parent might have an ITIN. And essentially our guidance is you do not want to enter an ITIN in the space for a social security number on the application. So like I mentioned, a parent without a social security number, they won't be able to create an FSA ID, and therefore they're not going to be able to sign the FAFSA electronically. They can still help their student complete the FAFSA. So what they're going to do instead is print out the signature page from the online form, and then they're going to sign it and mail it to the address indicated. So we did receive a question during oh, go ahead, Dylan. I see you have your hand raised.
I was just going to say, in addition with the ITIN, something you may encounter quite often is that ITINs do not actually provide authorization to work. And so it's common for them to have that ITIN on their tax forms, but not have a W-2 in correlation with that. So that can complicate things on the FAFSA application itself. And we just say, the best thing to do when trying to figure out how much parents made is work with the parent to, find other ways or do as close as a best guess as you can.
Yes, so someone with an ITIN may or may not have income documents that you would expect. So one registrant asked, how can parents be sure that the college receiving the student's FAFSA information won't report the family, since the parent, by entering all zeros for their social security number, might be unintentionally flagging their undocumented status? And so thank you very much for raising that question. It's very important, and we certainly understand the concern around it. That's why we recommend that a student with undocumented parents have an advocate with them during each stage of the financial aid process. So that's from FAFSA submission all the way through award offers and award acceptance with the College of Interest. But I would say this, there are multiple reasons a parent might not have a social security number. So it doesn't automatically imply that the parent is undocumented, but it certainly could lead the college to ask further questions, which is why we recommend having someone accompany the student in this process. Ultimately, the student should never answer a question that makes them uncomfortable or they perceive as a threat to their family's safety. We're going to talk a little bit more about this later on in the webinar. But we understand your concern that it could be flagging the student in some way. And Dylan shared a little bit of his experience when a student has a parent who's undocumented and they enter all zeros on the FAFSA, that it doesn't automatically flag that student for the institutions where they're applying, but it might lead to further questions. Anything you wanted to add to that, Dylan, or?
Yeah, and just through my experience and my team's experience that we've had, we've never encountered any situations where students had complications, major complications with this. So hopefully it's still a safe resource. I am in Utah though, it's a different state, but ultimately I tell the family, honestly, it's up to you, whatever decision you want to make, but as far as we know, it's safe.
And that is how federal student aid guides us for students who are in this situation. But the concern is really then what the colleges and universities do with that information afterward. So it's something to be aware of. And with this advice in mind, it's important to note that students might have to complete follow-up tasks if they're selected for verification, and these tasks themselves might present some challenges if the student has undocumented parents. So again, we recommend contacting us at Alabama Possible for assistance. But just as a reminder, verification is a process for providing additional paperwork to essentially verify information submitted on the FAFSA. So this might involve providing a tax transcript so that the financial info can be verified. And if a student is a US citizen, but their parents are undocumented, providing that tax transcript could pose some challenges for the student. So one example could be that the students' parents don't file taxes, but they do have a tax filing requirement based just on the amount of income they earn. So these verification situations are ones in which students with undocumented parents should have someone guiding them through the process. But just to overall recap this main question, a parent's citizenship status will not impact a student's aid eligibility, but it could impact how the student completes some of the steps in applying for federal financial aid. So as a reminder, one of the requirements for students was that they are either a US citizen or an eligible non-citizen. And so we're going to define that a little bit further. In the student demographics section of the FAFSA, it will ask about a student's citizenship status, and the student can respond one of three ways. Yes, I am a US citizen or US national. No, but I am an eligible non-citizen. And then no, I am not a citizen or eligible non-citizen. So depending on which option the student selects, their process for moving forward will differ. And if option 1 applies and the student is a US citizen or US national, then they will just proceed forward with the application. If option 2 applies and the student is an eligible non-citizen, then they will need to provide their alien registration number and proceed forward. And then if option 3 applies and the student is not a citizen or eligible non-citizen, then they can proceed forward with limited aid options. And they really should only proceed forward on the FAFSA after contacting the financial aid office at each college they might attend to ask whether or not completing the FAFSA is the appropriate step. So we'll talk a little bit more about this later. But diving in a little deeper into that first option, US citizens are persons who are born in the 50 states, the District of Columbia, and in most cases, Puerto Rico, the US Virgin Islands, Guam, and the Northern Mariana Islands. And US citizens also include most persons born abroad to a parent or parents who are citizens. And then US nationals are natives of American Samoa or Swains Island. Now, if we look into more detail with option number 2, we're looking at eligible non-citizens. So if a student is not a US citizen or US national, they might be an eligible non-citizen if they can provide other documentation such as the following. So we have a green card for a permanent resident, an arrival departure record for a refugee, asylee, parolee, and others. Have a T visa holder for victims of human trafficking, battered immigrant status for victims of abuse. And then we have citizenship of the Federated States of Micronesia, the Republic of the Marshall Islands, and the Republic of Palau. And then finally, we have if they have status under the J Treaty. So this applies to certain Canadian-born Native Americans. So as you can see in this screenshot, eligible non-citizens will be prompted to enter their 8 or 9-digit alien registration number. But if a student selects option 3, then they're likely an ineligible non-citizen, which means they will not be eligible for federal student aid. So these students include those who have been granted DACA or Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, those who have an F1 or F2 student visa, or who have a J1 or J2 exchange visitor visa, or have a G series visa pertaining to international organizations. So these are folks who are not eligible for federal aid. And to elaborate on that, some DACA recipients will have a social security number. So they might be able to complete the FAFSA to determine eligibility, not for federal aid, but for state or institutional aid. And in this case, it is best to start by asking the college or university how that student with DACA should apply for financial aid. So before they even begin the application, reaching out to the college or university to see what their path forward would be. And I'll mention here, if a student cannot and should not complete the FAFSA because they're an ineligible non-citizen, then high school educators in Alabama can use the FAFSA waiver with this student so that they can complete their high school graduation task. All right, so we've reviewed federal aid eligibility, and I'm now going to turn it over to Dylan, who will lead us through some FAFSA scenarios.
Thank you, May. So I've just got a couple of scenarios here to kind of give us a little bit of practice and kind of put our minds in, situations of what we would have with students. And that first one is, our first situation is Elizabeth. So these are not real names or real student situations. If it somehow, for some reason, coordinates with one of your students, it was not planned for that. So these are completely made up. But Elizabeth was born in the US and has a social security number. Elizabeth is considered a dependent student for the purposes of the FAFSA. Her parents don't have social security numbers. Only Elizabeth's father works, and her parents file taxes using their individual taxpayer identification number, or ITIN, which May discussed earlier. So how do we best assist Elizabeth here? So since Elizabeth is a citizen, she can file the FAFSA, and she qualifies for Title IV federal financial aid. When it comes to the FSA ID, Elizabeth needs to create hers, but her parents cannot because they do not have social security numbers. So I'm just going to skip over that step. And then on the FAFSA application itself, her parents will just put in those zeros for the social security number. And like May kind of discussed earlier, an ITIN is used in place for the social security number on tax forms. And so it may come up as a number that they want to put in on that FAFSA application. It is not a replacement for a social on the FAFSA. So if parents do use an ITIN number in place of a social security number, it will be rejected after a database check with the Social Security Administration. So please, please, please never instruct families to use their ITIN to create an FSA ID nor to complete the FAFSA. And then when it comes to signing the FAFSA, the student will just sign with the FSA ID, and then their parents, which is a little bit different, will need to print the signature page, sign it, and then mail their signature page in. Please, 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 it's so important when they're doing this process, make sure the student submits their FAFSA application after printing the signature page, or it won't get processed. FSA will receive the signature, and since they don't have any application to link it to, it'll most likely just possibly get thrown away. So then the student has to restart the whole process. And that can get really complicated, especially knowing how long it may take for the application to get processed, because when mailing a signature, it can take 5 to 10 weeks to get processed. So that's a long time in and of itself. You do need to be aware of deadlines, so the students do make those deadlines, or talk with the college or university about the student situation. And like I said, if you don't click submit and submitted that signature, wait the 5 to 10 weeks, and you have to restart that whole process again. That can get really lengthy. So do be aware of that. I think that's all I have. We can keep moving forward then. So the second situation here is Jalen. So Jalen and his family came to the US when he was 7. He currently has DACA. Jalen is considered a dependent student for the purposes of the FAFSA. And when I'm talking about dependent student for the purposes of the FAFSA, I mean that he is required to provide his parental information and he is not independent. Jalen has a DACA issued social security number, but his parents do not have social security numbers. Both his parents work, but they don't have enough gross income to have a tax filing requirement. Basically meaning that they don't meet that income threshold. And if you're curious about what that income threshold is, I have a link down here below that provides information from the IRS. It's the IRS publication 17, which has a little chart or a little table that they have on the actual document. It's page 6, but if you're looking at the PDF, it's the 8th page overall. And you can kind of explore that when assisting students. We use this quite often. But to move forward, how can we best help Jalen? So as a DACA recipient, Jalen doesn't qualify for federal aid, like May discussed earlier. And I put as of December 6th, just because there's a possibility this could change with the Build Back Better Act. DACA issued social security numbers and I put an example here as a picture. It has in wording up there, is valid for work only with DHS authorization. So it's a little bit different here with the Social Security number that they receive. So should a DACA student file a FAFSA? The answer overall is possibly. What we recommend is to have a student work, or you talk with the college and ask if they should complete the FAFSA or if they should complete some alternative so that they can figure out how to calculate Jalen's EFC number. And this can open doors to possible scholarships, private scholarships, and other types of aid to the state and institution. Dream centers and other similar organizations are also great resources if you have them or they are connected with the institutions that can help provide more information about this or open doors to other aid options. So what type of aid can Jalen receive? He can receive private scholarships on the national level, the state level, and the institutional level. And there's other types of aid out there available depending on the institution and the state. Just be aware, though, that some private scholarships may require proof of citizenship or the FAFSA to be completed for the student to qualify for that scholarship. So it's good to kind of look over the requirements, or at least provide the student with that information so they can look over the requirements, so they don't start an application for a scholarship that requires citizenship or the FAFSA. What we recommend is stay up to date with state and federal policy, just so you know what's going on. One of the big policies we have here in Utah is that if a student attends 3 years of a Utah high school and graduates from Utah high school, then they may qualify for in-state tuition. And just keeping an eye on the different policies that are in place is good as well. Also, another thing we recommend is get them connected with resources and organizations who can help them, like Alabama Possible. Here in Utah, we have different institutions that have dream centers, which are great resources to help our students. And then we also have other partnerships and organizations that are available to support any students when we do want to recommend them to them. So, and I put a link there down at the bottom for just more information when it comes to financial aid and undocumented students and DACA students. So. The final situation or scenario is Manuel. And this scenario actually threw me through a whole loophole the other day with trying to figure out the right information for this. So Manuel and his mother have been granted asylum and have I-94 forms. They have received their social security numbers, but are still waiting to receive their alien registration numbers. Sometimes it can take a little bit of time before they can actually get those numbers. And so they may have just an I-94 and a social security. Manuel is considered a dependent student for the purposes of the FAFSA, and both Manuel and his mother work. So does Manuel qualify for aid? Since Manuel has been granted asylum, he qualifies for Title IV aid. He is an eligible non-citizen. When creating an FSA ID and on the FAFSA itself, Manuel will use his social security number. Now, even though he doesn't have his A number yet, he still qualifies for aid. When answering the question about citizenship, he will select, it had those 3 different ones. I'm an eligible non-citizen, but since he doesn't yet have that A number, he can actually skip the part that asks for the A number itself. I tested that out actually yesterday on the demo site, and I talked to a college financial aid office to confirm that that was okay. And they said it was. So just know this is for specifically students with I-94s. This may not be the same situation for other students who have different immigration statuses and are eligible non-citizens. The student will likely need to follow up with the colleges where he's going to apply to, or the colleges that will actually reach out to him because they're going to probably get a notification from FSA that they need a confirmation of citizenship because they have a specific social security number that's separate, and so that A number is also missing. And so they're going to need just to show the documentation of the I-94 paperwork to confirm he's an eligible non-citizen. So they have the right documentation, they're good to go. The mother will need to put her social security number on the FAFSA, but if for some reason she hasn't received that yet, which this is kind of rare, she'll just put all zeros for the social security number because it ultimately doesn't affect the aid. When it comes to reporting tax information on the FAFSA, it will depend on where they completed their taxes, whether that was here in the US or in their country of origin. And this can depend on how soon they have come over to the US. If the parents filed taxes in their country of origin, for example, we're in the 2022-2023 FAFSA application, so it takes the 2020 tax info. They'll just need to convert how much their parents made into US dollars and any of those other major questions that are on the FAFSA financials portion. So do note that it may take a little bit of math, but they do need to convert that over. Yeah, that's all I have for scenarios.
Thank you, Dylan. So just to kind of recap what we've gone through so far, we talked about federal aid eligibility, and then Dylan led us through some scenarios where students were both eligible for federal aid and ineligible for federal aid. So for those students who are ineligible for federal aid or Title IV aid, what are their options exactly? So if the student is not eligible for federal aid, scholarships are likely the best option. Colleges and universities might also offer institutional aid in the form of scholarships. So it's good to check with the financial aid office of each school where a student is intending to apply. And then there are private scholarship opportunities, and these are available from local organizations such as HECA in Alabama and Fiesta in Alabama. Both of these are local options for Alabama students. And then there are national opportunities as well, and these can be found through databases and curated lists, such as the following. So we have the JLV College Counseling website that puts together a list, CapEx, where you can filter by opportunities that don't require citizenship status. Immigrants Rising also does a great list of scholarship opportunities as well as fellowship opportunities for graduate students. And then Get Schooled also puts together a list. So ultimately, we recommend looking at scholarship aid, and we recommend doing that both through local organizations as well as national lists. But what we know is that having these conversations with students and families can be extremely difficult, not only because you're talking about very complex immigration situations, but also because of the way that the law limits certain immigrant populations in their access to post-secondary education. And we know y'all are trying to support your students in their pursuit of education. So we want to equip you with strategies and tools for having these conversations with families. So what we have available for y'all, and you'll be able to access this when we send out the follow-up email after the webinar. We have a blog post with all different resources pertaining to the FAFSA that are in Spanish. The Federal Student Aid Financial Aid Toolkit does a lot of their resources both in English and in Spanish. Also on that blog post, we have aid eligibility explanations similar to what we covered today. And then we have the scholarship resources that I just mentioned. Then I also wanted to say, because this webinar is mostly focused on kind of the financial aid process, more so than the general college going process, we have put together a one-pager with college FAQs for undocumented families. So we created this resource specifically for undocumented families because they are more restricted in their options, both for college and financial aid. So this one pager will answer questions like, I'm an undocumented student, where can I even apply to college? So we saw that question in our registration process. So we wanted to make sure we were addressing all of your questions through that resource. But now I'm going to turn it back over to Dylan to discuss some tips for talking to families and specifically those with immigrant backgrounds?
Thank you, May. Yeah, I always love to make sure, we learn the material, we learn what's going on, we have the resources available, but also just like how on the ground, how to work with students. And so these are just a couple of recommendations. I know there's plenty more out there, and take what you feel like you can really take from this. But when talking to students and parents, the number one thing I always like to tell everyone is just to be mindful. Not everyone is comfortable talking about their citizenship status. So don't directly ask, let the students and parents bring it up on their own, if they're willing. Now, we don't want to pry, we don't want to push, and that can make things difficult because that leaves us in a big unknown, but we never want to push, pry, or assume. And so to kind of help with that, in connection with this being mindful, is make your conversations more universal and inclusive. And I can't tell you how many times just doing this in my conversations has opened doors for me to help students and parents. So in the different instructions that you give and the different conversations, just make sure that the information you provide is for all different types of situations. An example that I like to give is when you're assisting a student with an FSA ID, just to say something like this, you need to create an FSA ID for both the student and one parent. And then that's like the basic, right, instruction. And then I always add, unless the parent does not have a social security number, then they will need to print, sign, and mail their signature page at the end. Just a quick little add-on there for the students it does apply to. They're informed, they know what to do, they can move forward. For those that it doesn't really apply to, it kind of just goes over their head and they're like, oh yeah, I have, my parents have their social, I don't have to worry about that. So I just say that to all students, and it actually opens a lot of doors. I can't tell you how many times a lot of students have just said that they've opened up to me because I've included that. In addition, educate yourself. Know the policy, be aware of what situations these families may be in, and just knowing how to help them can open a lot of doors. It helps them feel more comfortable talking to you because you know their situations, the policies behind it, and that you're informative, and that you can provide the right information to them, or at least provide the right place or resource to get that assistance. And so, yeah. Moving forward as well, building relationships builds trust. Many of you probably have a lot of interactions with students. Some are short, some are long-lived, and you can really build that trust. But you as a professional will get opportunities to build those relationships with families and students through your interactions. And so just make sure each interaction that you have and encounter that you have is professional so that you can build that foundation of trust. And this is the same with online professionalism. People see things everywhere. So just make sure you're aware of that. And it's very easy to lose trust. So work hard. And another thing that I thought of while May was talking was, I can add this to my list, is provide resources in other languages if you can. That gets rid of some barriers for a lot of students if they have resources that they or their parents can read in their own language. So that's another great one too. In addition, just verbalize your commitment to confidentiality and discretion. Make sure that the students and parents know that you are a safe resource. And I want to give you the example of Alabama if possible today, because May has said multiple times, if you need help, we're here to help you with these different situations. That right there gives you that confirmation that you know where to go. And that's the same with students and parents. You letting them know, verbalizing it, and telling them that you are a safe resource allows them to come to you in that need. And also telling them that you do not share personal information with others, that you keep your interactions safe and confidential, is also very important. Unless for items like mandatory reporting or mandated reporting items that you are required. But another thing that helps as well is having visuals in your office, around you, on different things that show that you're committed as a safe resource. I've used the example here with these images of the Dreamers butterfly, having that up in your office can possibly open some doors um, to allow students to ask for assistance. May I notice you came off mute? Did you want to say anything?
I was just going to say really quickly, we were having a conversation in the chat about resources being translated into other languages. And while a lot of federal student aid resources are in English and Spanish, there are some resources that still need to be translated. We were talking specifically about Alabama's FAFSA waiver only being available in English. So we are working hard to make sure that it is translated into other languages, thanks to our great partners over at HICA.
Love that. Yeah, and we recognize that with a lot of our resources as well, and we've been trying to opening up, at least here over with USHE, with a lot of the different resources we have. We did one on undocumented students and immigrant families. It's just a one-pager that provides information in, I think we have it up to like 9 to 11 languages. So having that available is also great, and knowing where to find those is also great too. Partnerships. Consider formulating partnerships in your area with nonprofits, community-based organizations, or even just trusted leaders in your community. We recommend this that you know, like we've talked about, have a place to go when needed and help, but also to have somebody to trust when you're hosting like events, like FAFSA completion, different efforts that you have. Sometimes having a community member that the people trust can be inviting for them to come to an event. And then another one that I've added is just avoiding microaggressions. I've added a little video link here to microaggressions. That's really helped me and my team understand how they affect people. And it's very insightful. We just want to make sure that everyone's creating, or the students and families have a place that's safe and private, that they can be heard and have these different conversations. And same with your teams, being able to talk about microaggressions, different situations that is, you know, important to help you open doors and to get rid of that barrier of a microaggression that pushes students and families away. And so having a safe and private place to have those conversations with your team is also important. And that's about all I have for tips talking in families. But I recommend there's a lot of other ones out there. Go find what you found to be important and helpful to assisting your students.
Definitely. Thank you, Dylan. And I want to reiterate, as you're having conversations with students and families, if you're not yet comfortable doing that, again, Alabama Possible is happy to join you in those conversations and help facilitate those. So we're happy to do that. So we have an opportunity for questions now. I don't see too many in the chat, just asking where we can be contacted for assistance. So y'all can reach us through our phone line, which I'll just go ahead and go to the next slide so you can see that. You can call us at 334-316-6155, or you can shoot us an email at algoestocollege@alabamapossible.org. What we encourage y'all to do, if you have super specific questions, is to set a meeting with us, maybe over Zoom. We understand that some of these immigration situations are extremely complicated, and we really like to review all of the details of a student's specific situation so that we can give our best and most informed guidance. So it's awesome if you want to go ahead and shoot an email with some of the student's situation, but we'll probably want to follow up with you just to make sure we're understanding every aspect of the situation and not missing anything. Like you saw in today's webinar, there are lots of little exceptions and lots of little things that change your steps moving forward. So we just want to make sure we have the full picture before giving any guidance. But unless you have any further questions, we will go ahead and thank you for joining us today, giving us your time. We know y'all are incredible advocates for your students, and we're excited that you want to learn more to be able to support them. Thank you again to Dylan for joining today's webinar. Dylan does so much great work researching for students, spent a lot of time on the Federal Student Aid Hotline yesterday, trying to understand these situations. And I'm so thankful for Dylan's partnership. So thank y'all again for joining today. And if there are no further questions, we're going to go ahead and let you back into your day.